Hi everyone, and welcome to another crime and punishment story. This week I am covering the story of Robert Cummings and the murder of Harriet Walls, which took place in Gateshead in 1905. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just also like to add that I do record these stories live, so do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify. So I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. Robert Cummings was born in Durham in around 1886 to parents Joseph and Margaret, and he was one of at least 7 children. At the time of the murder, he was around 19 years old and worked as a miner. He was described as being 5'3" tall, with dark brown hair and hazel eyes. Robert had for a time lived with the family of Harriet Walls. However, he had moved out some 7 months prior to the murder taking place. There was no mention of Robert having any issues with drink. It seems he was a good worker at Dunstan, where he now worked, and not seen to be the kind who was fond of arguments or fights. Harriet Walls, the victim, was born in Durham in around 1888 to parents David and Harriet, and she was one of at least 3 children. At the time of the murder, she was around 17 years old. The family had moved to Gateshead sometime between 1891 and 1901, where Harriet's father worked as a coal miner. Harriet herself worked in service and had been employed for a time at Jesmond, but more recently she'd been working at Barnard Castle. However, she had returned home around 3 weeks prior to the murder taking place. She had known Robert for quite some time, and for the past 12 months the couple had been walking out together, as it was described in those days. And during her time in service at Barnard Castle, the couple had kept in contact by letter. On November the 2nd, 1905, Robert wrote to Harriet at her home in Howard Street in Gateshead, arranging to meet her that day. However, he did not turn up. He finally arrived on November the 5th, and the couple, who to everyone around them seemed to be on friendly terms, went out for a walk. They did not walk far, often only to the top of the street where Harriet lived. Harriet's father, who left the house a few minutes after the couple, saw them walking down the street arm in arm. Not long after this, Robert returned to the family home alone. Harriet's mother asked Robert where her daughter was. Robert was acting strangely, and he told Harriet's mother, "She has rejected me, and I could not resist temptation. She is lying at the top of the street." Mrs. Walls rushed straight out to look for Harriet, but was unable to see her. And on returning home, Robert was still in the house, and she asked him to take her to where Harriet was, which he did, showing her the body of poor Harriet just 2 doors up, lying in an empty plot where a new house was soon to be built. Mrs. Walls went straight to her, but it was too late. Harriet was already dead. She could not see any marks on her body or any signs of blood. She turned to ask Robert what he had done, but he was gone. She then went to find a neighbour to help her, and the neighbour came out to look at Harriet and then immediately went to find a policeman. Mrs. Walls stayed with Harriet until the policeman arrived, and the policeman in turn then sent for a doctor and accompanied Mrs. Walls back to her home. There they found Robert sitting in a chair in the kitchen. After asking Robert what he had done, P.C. Sanderson then took him away to the police station on a charge of wilful murder of Harriet Walls. The body of Harriet was then taken back to her family home, and it was here that the doctor would do his examination, and he believed that she had been dead only a short time and that her death had been caused by strangulation. The inquest took place at Gateshead Town Hall, opening on November the 7th. Those present were Chief Constable Trotter and the parents of Harriet Walls. No others were present, and the coroner stated the inquest would be adjourned after the identification of the body to allow the police more time to gather evidence. Mrs. Walls said she had identified the body as that of her 17-year-old daughter Harriet. She said the family lived at Howard Street in Gateshead and that she had last seen her daughter alive on Sunday, November the 5th, 1905, when she had gone out walking with Robert Cummings. When she was asked, she said the couple had appeared to her to be on good terms, and since Harriet's return home from Barnard Castle around 3 weeks earlier, Robert had been a regular visitor to their home. She did not think he was of a bad character. His mother had died and his father had thrown him out of their home, although she did not know why, and this was the reason he had briefly lived with them. She said it had been her own son who had asked for him to lodge with them, as he had nowhere else to go. She was asked why he had later moved out, and she said it was because he had not been able to find work locally, so had moved closer to his new workplace at Dunstan. She did not mention any problems with his behaviour during the time he had lived with the Walls family. After this evidence, the inquest was adjourned. It reopened on November the 10th at Gateshead Police Courts. Robert Cummings was present at his own request. David Walls said he was a minor living at Howard Street in Gateshead and that Harriet was his daughter. He spoke of how Robert had lived with the family for a time, but in more recent months he had been living at Dunstan. He said the couple had been keeping company for around 12 months and they had always appeared to be on good terms. And since Harriet's return home from Barnard Castle, Robert had visited them 2 or 3 times a week. However, his visits had stopped around October the 29th, though he did not know why. He said Robert had sent Harriet a letter saying that he planned to visit on November the 2nd, but he did not turn up. He then said he would visit on November the 3rd, but again did not turn up. And then he turned up unexpectedly on November the 5th. He said he had been at home when Robert arrived. He had spoken to him and he seemed in good spirits, and as far as he could tell, Robert and Harriet were on friendly terms when they left the house at around 10 to 6 that night. David said he left the house at around 6:10 on his way to the Pear Tree Inn, and he saw Harriet and Robert arm in arm heading back in the direction of the house. He spoke to his daughter and asked if they were heading home, and she said yes. He did not hear any conversation between them, and all still seemed to be fine. He knew no more until a neighbour came to the Pear Tree Inn to tell him what had happened, and he immediately made his way home, where he found Robert in the kitchen. He said he spoke to him saying, "You scoundrel, what have you done to my daughter?" But Robert did not reply. He said that a short time after this, P.C. Sanderson took Robert away, and then the body of his daughter was brought into the house. Mrs. Walls was recalled, and she was asked if Harriet had told her of a letter that Robert had sent her when she had been at Barnard Castle, and she said yes. Harriet had told her that Robert had made threats towards her in the letter. She had shown her the letter, but she had not been able to read it in full. Mrs. Walls was then shown a copy of the letter and said it was indeed written by Robert Cummings and that the letter her daughter had shown her was the same one. She said she did not know if Harriet had been upset by the letter when she received it, but she herself had not liked it, and had she been able to get it off her daughter, she would have taken it to the police. But her daughter had taken it and she had not been able to find it. Mrs. Mary Ebdale said she was a neighbour of the Walls family, also living in Howard Street, and she had been in their house when Robert had arrived. She did not notice any problems between him and Harriet, and they seemed happy enough when they had left for their walk. She said she had still been in the house when Robert returned alone and told what he had done. She said he seemed quite calm when he told Mrs. Walls where to find her daughter's body. Hilda Johnson said she was 11 years old and also lived in Howard Street. She had been outside on the night of the crime and had seen Harriet and Robert walking together. She claimed that they had turned a corner out of view, but that she had heard Harriet cry out, "Oh, don't kill me," and then, "Oh, mother." She did not hear or see any more after this. Dr. Robinson said he was called to Howard Street on Sunday, November the 5th. He said on examining Harriet he found some marks on both sides of her neck, and he believed she had died due to strangulation. He said he had also performed the post-mortem, and this had confirmed his cause of death. When asked, he said there could have been no other way in which Harriet could have been killed. P.C. Sanderson said he had been called by a neighbour by the name of James Young, and he had gone to the scene and found the body lying on the ground in an open space where a new house was in the process of being built. He had then gone to the Walls family home where he had found Robert Cummings in the living room. He said he had asked Robert what he had done, and he had replied simply by saying, "Take me, I have strangled her." He said when he was later charged with the wilful murder of Harriet Walls, Robert had made no reply. The coroner stated that this was a very sad case. It was clear to those who had heard the evidence and the confession of Robert that no one else could have committed this crime. He said if the jury were satisfied that Robert had been the one to strangle Harriet, then it could only be a verdict of murder and nothing else. The jury took only seconds to return a verdict of guilty of wilful murder, and Robert Cummings was committed for trial. The funeral of Harriet Walls took place on November the 9th, 1905. On leaving the house, her coffin was placed outside, and the choir from the Sunderland Road Primitive Methodist Church gathered round it to sing a hymn. After this, it was said that crowds of people lined the roads as the funeral procession made its way to Gateshead Cemetery, and more crowds gathered at the graveside. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Harriet Walls. The trial took place at Durham at the end of November before Mr. Justice Darling. Robert was said to be slightly pale, but otherwise showed no outward signs of the terrible position he was in. When asked, he pleaded not guilty in a strong, clear voice. The main part of the evidence given at the trial was the same as at the inquest, so I won't repeat it, but it was also at this point that several letters were read out to the jury, which had been sent by both Harriet and Robert while Harriet had been working at Barnard Castle. The first letter gave a clear insight into something that had upset Robert deeply and sent him on the path to murder. I will not read the full details of each letter as some of them are quite long. However, I will include some of the more important details from each one. The first letter was from Harriet, where she talked of Robert suggesting their relationship was over. She said she did not think it was, and that her mother was not going to come between them, and she hoped they could all get along. She ended the letter by saying, "I hope to hear from you soon, from your affectionate friend." Robert's response to this showed he was not happy that she had signed herself friend and not lover. He spoke of how he could not change her from his sweetheart to his friend as he loved her too much. He said he did not understand her reasons for this, going on to say that he would keep himself right until he had seen her mother, who he owed money to. Then he would be done with this world, and it would be Harriet's fault. He did not end there, though. He continued by saying that he would try to keep out of her way, as seeing her may make him commit a thing he was trying hard not to do. Harriet had replied immediately to this letter, and in her reply she said she did not think he was in his right senses. She said she had always been true to him, but that he had made her life a misery, and she hoped he could be more reasonable. She said if he did the worst, it was not her fault, as she had done all she could for him. She said she would keep away from him if he thought it was better that they should part. One last letter was read out to the jury, and this was from Robert to Harriet, and in it he spoke of not having heard from her for some time, and how it was driving him mad. He said he had been to her house to see if she had written, but she had not. He had been forsaken by her, which he thought he would be. The letter then took a more sinister turn. Robert said he would not let her slip away from him so easily, and if he did not hear from her, he would visit her at her workplace, and he thought it would be a sorry end for both of them, stating that he had bought a little instrument that would soon put them into another world, and that he would do it as this was no idle threat. However, if she was to write to him soon, he would forgive her. But if she did not, he said, she could guess her end. He ended the letter by saying, "If you write, all will be forgiven, but if not, then I live for revenge for a broken heart." And this last letter was the one that was mentioned at the inquest that had upset Mrs. Walls. A further small piece of evidence came to light in the form of a statement made by Robert himself, where he stated that on the night he had gone for a walk with Harriet, she had told him she no longer wanted to spend time with him, and that this, it seems, had tipped him over the edge. The defence then tried to suggest that Robert had not been in his right mind at the time he committed the murder. He had been insanely jealous, and Harriet had given him up. However, it was said that he had been quite calm both before and after the murder, and had answered the questions from P.C. Sanderson both clearly and calmly, which it was felt suggested a man who clearly knew what he was doing and what he had done. And it was also stated that he had made threats to Harriet in his letters, which did not sound like a man who had been overcome by sudden insanity. The judge, in summing up, said where was the evidence of insanity? It had not been proven. And he stated that even a sane man would appear somewhat disturbed, having just committed a murder. It was clear, he said, that this crime was committed by the man who had confessed to it just moments later. He went on to say that Robert had been unhappy that she had signed herself as his affectionate friend, and it seems he had been insanely jealous of the girl, believing her to be planning to leave him for someone else. The letters, he said, proved that Robert had previously threatened Harriet Walls, suggesting that the little instrument was mentioned to make her write to him either to save herself or to stop him from harming himself. It was, he said, a clear threat, and one which Robert had carried out. It was never made clear what the little instrument was that Robert claimed he had bought, but we have to assume that it was either a revolver or a knife. The jury retired for only 10 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of willful murder against Robert Cummings, but with a strong recommendation to mercy on account of his age. The judge said that the jury had found the only verdict possible given the evidence they had heard. He then sentenced Robert to death by hanging, and that his remains would be buried within the walls of Durham Prison. Robert, who had been quiet and calm throughout, was then led from the dock and taken back to Durham Prison to await his fate, and the execution date was set for December the 12th at 8 a.m. A petition for a reprieve was started almost immediately, even though Robert had stated he did not want this, saying he would rather die than spend the rest of his life in prison. And it would seem that the main reason for the reprieve was Robert's young age. And although this had been used in several other cases in the past, and would be in the future too, it did not always result in the guilty party being saved from the hangman's noose. The petition would end up gaining around 4,000 signatures before being sent to the Home Secretary. While in prison awaiting the outcome of the petition, Robert would write many letters to his family and friends, including a letter that he sent to Harriet's mother. In this letter he stated how sorry he was for what he had done, and how he did not know what had come over him, and he could not remember how it had happened. He also asked her to forgive him, saying, "If it is God's will that I should die, I would die ever so much happier if you will forgive me." He ended the letter by wishing the family well, including Harriet's brother, who was due to be married in December. I did not find any evidence of a reply from Mrs. Walls, so I do not know if she ever found the strength to forgive Robert for what he had done. Robert also wrote to his father, and it was in this letter that he said he did not wish to be saved, stating that he would rather die 1,000 deaths than spend the rest of his life in prison, going on to say that he thought his sentence of death was just, as he believed in a life for a life. However, it would seem that the petition had worked, as a letter was soon received to say that the sentence of death passed on Robert Cummings had been commuted to one of penal servitude for life. Although I was not able to find any details to confirm that Robert was sent immediately to Parkhurst Prison, it was certainly from here in 1922 that he was released at the age of around 36 years after serving 16 full years of his sentence. I was not able to completely confirm any details for him after this date. However, there was a Robert Cummings who did fit with his place of birth and his date of birth, who died in Gateshead in 1968 at the age of around 81, but this of course may not be the right person. This was an incredibly tragic story. It was unclear until the evidence of the letters as to what the motive truly was for the awful crime that Robert had committed. After the letters were discussed, it was easy to see just how jealous Robert was of Harriet, and from her letters it seems this was not a new thing, and she had been fed up of trying to cope with him. Signing her letter "Affectionate Friend" had been the start of his final fall into the depths of insane jealousy, and although it seems that the couple had in some way remained on good terms up until that last night, Harriet then telling him that she did not want to spend time with him anymore was more than he could take. Was he out of his mind at the time he committed the murder? Well, perhaps to some he was, as he was insane with jealousy, and this no doubt stopped him from thinking clearly, but he had already threatened to hurt or kill Harriet in his letters, so a moment of insanity could never truly have worked as his defence. Harriet had done nothing wrong to deserve to lose her life at such a young age. And again, I found it tragic that after the reprieve, Robert was released just a few short years later, not even serving a year for every year of Harriet's short life. But what do you think? Do you think it was the right decision to commute the sentence to prison for life? And do you think it was right that Robert was released after serving only 16 years of his sentence? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And I must apologise, though although mentioning that I often make mistakes, I did seem to make rather more than normal in this video, so I am sorry about that. I do hope that you have found this sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.